All right. Thanks everyone for joining. So my name is Paul Katz, and I lead the Jane Family Institute's Social Wealth Initiative. We're an international team that partners with governments and civil society organizations to align public assets with national development goals. On behalf of all of my colleagues at JFI, it is my great pleasure to welcome you to our New York Climate Week half-day symposium on just and green development in the Global South, here at the Graduate Center of the indispensable Public City University of New York. If you'll allow me a personal indulgence at the outset of what I solemnly promise to be no more than 7 minutes of introductory remarks, I would like to confess that when we launched JFI's social wealth portfolio in April of 2020, just as COVID-19 deaths were peaking in New York City, I was not thinking primarily about climate change. Our first social wealth project was a partnership with the Federal Fluminense University in Niterói, Brazil, to incubate a forum of Brazilian states and cities forming permanent savings and investment funds from oil and later mining royalties. These subnationals were working to turn temporary windfalls into stable budgets and socioeconomic development, at a moment when their value for COVID response could not have been clearer. So our government partners also were not thinking a lot about climate. And what they were hearing about climate from others was usually being framed not in terms of opportunity, but in the more exclusionary terms of ESG, environmental, social, and governance, a concept that they, like so many of my friends in developing countries, received with the skepticism of both corporate hypocrisy and the vastly larger historical emissions responsibilities of the global north. Fast forward 5+ years. Today, the Brazilian partners from that first project have become some of my closest friends. And they, like myself, along with many newer colleagues from across the world, reserve far greater skepticism for the idea that social development can be achieved separately from investment in climate resilience, adaptation, and mitigation. Where it was once possible to talk about these as separate projects, something like consensus has been built around the intertwined nature of these goals. Nonetheless, while the scale and urgency of the needed investment in the so-called Global South is undeniable, and the general shape of what is needed is not unknown, it is also the case that today, like 5 or 15 or 50 years ago, the money is not flowing. We are still trapped in what has come to be known as the Lucas paradox, that, as Robert Lucas observed in 1990, capital does not flow from wealthy countries where it is comparatively plentiful and growth tends to be low, into developing countries where capital is comparatively scarce and growth is often high. A decade after the tantalizing promise of the 2015 billions to trillions agenda, after all, billions have remained billions in the best case, while already inadequate multilateral norms face new challenges. One does not need to be an economist, and here I should add a second confession, that my PhD is not in econ, but in Latin American political history, to recognize that at least some of the explanation for this supposed paradox comes from institutional constraints on the part of investors, that at least some of it is behavioral, and that all of it exists within a world where the flow of capital cannot be divorced from geopolitical realities and narratives. Some of the smartest people in the world have been debating development for generations. We need to learn what we can from them in the context of our own moment of polycrisis. And then we need to get the money flowing, because if we don't do this second part, the first one is not going to save us. This is a through line that connects JFI's publication, Phenomenal World, to our work in Brazil. It extends to our collaboration with the Vulnerable 20 Group, now representing 74 countries especially susceptible to the effects of climate change, which are now working toward shared but differentiated development strategies. It informs our research on critical minerals, in particular, how surging demand for them can be wielded as a tool for natural resource-rich developing nations to capture the most value in service of their own development goals. So this morning, we're going to have 2 panels that bring analytically rich and implementation-informed perspectives to these pressing issues. We'll begin with a panel on leveraging public assets for South-led green growth. Then we'll pause for 10 minutes before continuing on with our second panel, creating and capturing value from critical mineral extraction, and end with closing remarks from our COO, Alex Jacobs. We have such an amazing group gathered here today So for each panel, we hope to be able to take at least one round of questions from the audience. And we are excited to continue the conversation more intimately from noon to 1, when we will have a light reception right here. Just one quick logistical point. The bathrooms are located behind the theater. So you go out, make a left, and then another left. Okay, and it is now my pleasure to introduce panel 1, leveraging public assets for South-led green growth. Wi-Fi, Wi-Fi, yes. There's a CUNY, thank you, that's a very good point. CUNY guest Wi-Fi, and you just enter your email, and hopefully it should be very easy. All right, and thank you, that's a good point. It is now my pleasure to introduce panel 1. I just said that, leveraging public assets for South-led green growth. I can only go paragraph by paragraph. We will approach the panel interview style, with a first round of questions about the macro financial context for green development, and a second round about the particular role of public assets, with a bonus lightning round at the end. The set of speakers assembled for this panel, and for our second one as well, is nothing short of a dream come true. So I ask the panelists, please be seated here at the front of the room as I call your names, and that we hold our applause until the entire panel has been seated. The first speaker is Richard Kozel-Wright. Richard is professor of sustainable structural transformation at SOAS, University of London. He is also a non-resident senior fellow with the Global Economic Governance Institute at Boston University's Global Development Policy Center. Previously, he served as director of the Globalization and Development Strategies Division at the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development. Feel free if you'd like to take a seat. I guess we'll moderator here, so wherever you'd like. Next is Laura Carvalho. Laura is Director of Economic and Climate Prosperity at Open Society Foundations and Associate Professor of Economics at the University of Sao Paulo. Her research stands at the intersection of macroeconomics and development, especially focusing on how economic growth interacts with income inequality. Next is Rafael Stein. Rafael is manager in the Public and Socioeconomic Management Division of BNDES, Brazil's National Development Bank. He works on socio-environmental finance, supporting initiatives in restoration, sustainable forest management, agroforestry, and combining productivity with environmental conservation in agriculture. Our last speaker is Pedro Rossi. Pedro is vice president and chief economist at the Global Fund for a New Economy and associate professor of economics at the University of Campinas in Brazil. He also serves as counselor to the Brazilian presidency in the Council for Economic, Social, and Sustainable Development. The panel will be moderated by Maria Fernanda Sikorsky. Maria is an editor, project manager, and lawyer based in Sao Paulo, for a name tag I saw recently, where she serves as senior editor of Phenomenal World. So please join me in welcoming our panel with a round of applause, after which, Maria, the floor is yours.
Well, good morning, everyone. If I could ask anyone from the team for help, so everyone has a little bottle of water. Let's sit down. Yeah. So the general framework of this panel is, the description is, since 2024, developing nations have paid more in debt service to official and private lenders than they have received in financing. And this makes it functionally impossible for many countries to invest sufficiently in the energy infrastructure transitions in which the sustainability of the global industrial civilization depends. At the same time, a growing set of sovereigns, development funds, national development banks, and other public financial institutions across the global south have adopted new strategies to mobilize public and private resources in service of increasingly muscular industrial policy agendas. And this panel will bring together, well, these guys to discuss strategies to leverage public assets to advance nationally determined green development objectives in low and middle income countries. So let's go to round one. Paul mentioned we have two, which is the micro-financial context for green development. We know that many developing countries, which are in fact already fiscally constrained, face massive debt burdens that result in net financial outflows together with exaggerated risk premia and a lot of volatility in private capital flows that make capital investment exorbitantly expensive. So how can states in the global south achieve equitable and green development goals given these constraints? Are there ways to mitigate or overcome them? I'll reframe this last one. How can we mitigate and overcome them? So Richard, I'd love to start with you in particular with a question of risk. We know the risk is often narrowly defined in short-termist and financialized ways that fail to account for long-term planetary or economic risks. And within the frame of financial risks, we know from the GM's database, the Global Emerging Market Risk database of 15,000 loans, that sovereign ratings often imply default rates 2 to 3 times higher than effective default rates. What market mechanisms or non-market based interventions might help correct this?
Yeah, thank you, Marie. Good morning to everybody. I'm beginning to feel like an honorary Brazilian on these kind of things. Yes, it's a great question. Let me just, I guess, pick up from where Paul started. I mean, it's clear that thinking of development and climate as intimately connected and inseparable today as a challenge. I think everyone probably agrees that the challenge is essentially a huge scaling up of investment. I mean, that's what is necessary. And everyone agrees on that. The disagreement starts after that statement has been made. I mean, the way in which that scaling up has been framed over the last 10 or more years, really, has been in terms essentially of risk management. And obviously investment, particularly large-scale investment, which is a decision that only unfolds over time and space, there is always a question of risk. But to associate capital formation with risk management, I think, unfortunately, is a product of the kind of financialized world that we have seen evolve over the last 4 decades, driven essentially by private capital. And I think that's, unfortunately, that has distorted the way we think about the kind of challenges that we face in the developing world. And obviously, this kind of thinking reached a kind of peak in the 1990s and the 2000s. It's when securitization and collateralization and de-risking and blending became the way in which we think about the investment challenge. It was a time in which ostensibly capital markets had solved the risk problem. That is, they had the knowledge, the intuition, and the instruments to essentially moderate and ultimately control risk. And some of you, I mean, it was Bernanke's The Great Moderation. It was Lucas arguing that we defeated the business cycle. It was the front page of Time magazine with the 3 men that had saved the world: Summers, Greenspan, and Robert Rubin. And the great promise was that in using these techniques to mobilize resources, we would provide the credit to solve the multiple investment challenges that not only developing countries but also developed countries were facing. And obviously that ideology faced the problem in 2008, 2009, that rather than generating capital formation and investment capital formation, investment in stuff did not fundamentally recover in the 90s and early 2000s from the collapse of the 1980s. It did a little bit, but certainly not on the anticipated or promised scale. But you had asset booms, is what you had, of one kind or another, multiple. And that, of course, culminated in the global financial crisis of 2008, 2009, which required, what did it require? It required what these people had promised was not necessary, which was massive state involvement in the economy. Bailouts followed, unfortunately, by austerity. The banks that had been the prominent players in previously were to some extent regulated, but the vacuum wasn't filled by public investment, needless to say. That was suffering from austerity. It was filled by a new form of financial investor in the form of asset managers and private equity and the new world of shadow banking, which was more or less doing the same kind of stuff that had been done over the previous 2 decades. That said, they kind of had a redemption moment, these people, with SDGs in 2015, with the SDGs and the Paris Agreement, where which was always, unfortunately, a limited way of thinking about the development problem too, but was certainly essentially a set of nice stuff in search of a meaningful paradigm, and that meaningful paradigm was provided by private finance. And so you had, of course, the billions to trillions. You had the eminent persons group at the G20 in Argentina on global financial governance. Eminent person, not expert, it was eminent, which tells you it's more important. And you had, of course, ultimately the GFANs in the culmination of that was the GFANs at the Glasgow COP, where Mark Carney waved a $130 trillion check and said, with a bit of help from my government friends, we can unlock that and solve the climate problem, essentially. And unfortunately, the problem is that the evidence for that kind of thinking, the evidence for public-private partnerships, the evidence on blending, does not suggest that it delivers on anything remotely close to the scale that is required. The chief economist of the World Bank referred to that as the results of this 10 years as pitiful in terms of the finance it's delivered. And so I think what we need to do now, in answer to your question, we need to rethink the paradigm. And for me, at least, capital formation is an issue first and foremost about domestic resource mobilization, and it has to have a very, very strong public imprint, including public investment. Is there blending? Yeah, there's blending. You've got to blend industrial policy with expansionary macro policy and strategic trade policy. But you're blending policies in this kind of approach. Does it need partnerships? Yeah, it needs partnerships. But they're not public-private partnerships at the heart of this. They're public-public partnerships. They're partnerships across the public sector, which both financial, technical, and policy-wise. Do you need de-risking? Well, kind of. You certainly need to discipline capital. Certainly finance capital, if you're going to get the kinds of results that are required on the scale and within the time frame that's needed. So I think that's where the alternative essentially needs to go.
Oh, thank you so much for that. I got a hook from the public-public partnership because we're talking about public assets here, and it can be either domestic or international. Then I'm gonna ask Rafael a question now. So, given your role at BNDES, you surely understand the promise and the challenges that we're talking about better than anyone. So, could you tell us a bit more about your role at the bank and the initiatives that you guys have been developing, and how do you understand and mitigate investor risk perceptions as they impact your work, but also maybe a few words on how the public-public sort of partnership develops inside the bank.
Well, thank you. Good morning, all. Well, at BNDES, we are always looking for the public policies and how can we help to implement these public policies. And when we look at Brazilian NDC and our national plan for recovery vegetation, we look at the Amazon and to the arc of deforestation in the Amazon. It's in the edge, the beginning of the Amazon, you go south to north. And we launch an initiative to transform this arc of deforestation in the arch of restoration. So we mobilize our capital and the funds that we manage with different financial instruments to change the region. We use grants with the Amazon Fund and with our own funds to achieve some type of properties like indigenous land, resettlements, small farmers, conservation units. And we ask other companies, other institutions to invest with us in match funding to improve the restoration in the region and helping to structure the value chain of restoration in the region. So we are also concerned in how can we generate income for these people that will sustain this restoration during the next years. And together with that, we have the resources from the Brazilian Climate Fund. It's some money for oil taxes that we can use to do concessional loans to companies. And together with that, we are helping the federal government and state governments to structure concessions in the regions, concessions for restoration and to sustainable use of timber. And with this financing, these companies, we have a cap of investment of our loans. So there is always other money coming together with our funds, equity and other investors in these companies. And we are also seeking money and raising money in other funds. The Brazilian government approved in the beginning of the year a loan with the Climate Investment Fund that together with some money from the World Bank, we are talking about $150 million that we're putting together with our money. And when we look at our grants and our match funding, these loans and the other investments that come with these loans, we are talking about almost $500 million investments in these regions to transform this deforestation area in a restoration area. And always looking for how it's going to work after we leave, after we end our investments. So we include productive forests in this to help these communities to generate income and to keep these green jobs in this kind of area. Okay.
Yeah, thank you. So off to Laura now. Um, Richard was just mentioning the importance of mobilizing domestic resources. That discussion has been gaining a lot of space recently. So domestic resources, sorry, to for investment in the just and green transition. But of course, this comes with unique challenges in countries vulnerable to capital flight or tax-based erosion. So thinking about questions like a global minimum tax, IFI reform, debt relief, what do you see as some of the most promising policy levers to pull to support domestic resource mobilization in this environment?
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Maybe I'll start from where Richard left us off. I think, given the limitations of, let's say, private capital mobilization in its different forms, to fill this gap, and in a context where also public resources from the north to the south are very scarce, and for different reasons. We're talking now about the cuts in development assistance and recent trends in the US, but it comes from way before, right? We had the European fiscal context and European fiscal debates have been such that it's becoming really, really hard to mobilize governments in Europe, for example, to provide public funding for the climate transition in the South. China, for itself, it fills some gaps, but it's mostly mobilizing capital for infrastructure that provides the commodities that they need for their own process, and it's not necessarily bringing the type of capital that is needed both for the climate transition and green industrialization in the South. And it, of course, in a context where also interest rates are becoming much, much higher as a result of, since the COVID pandemic, as a result of the global inflationary pressure that started off there, but was exacerbated by the invasion of Ukraine. And so all of that culminated in a situation where not only public resources are not coming in the right direction, but the Global South is actually sending more in interest payments than it's receiving, right, as we know. And interest rate, the cost of capital is really, really high in the South for anything, because the Fed itself responded by increasing rates. And as we know, countries in the South don't have a monetary policy autonomy that allows them to set their own policy rate. They basically respond to the policy rate that the Fed and the European Central Bank sets. Of course, they then face double the shock, because they also face the inflationary pressure that the COVID shock and the Ukraine war caused in the North. It was a global phenomenon, but they had to respond. And so this would already imply a rise in interest rates in the South, but then they had to do another round of interest rate increases because of the reversion in capital flows back to the North due to the Fed interest rate hike. So that context is very hard, not only for private capital mobilization, but also for domestic resource mobilization, right? If domestic financial institutions like BNDES, right, they're not funded anymore through, they hardly are funded by fiscal budgets. They are currently raising funds through in the market by issuing bonds. That's how Fundo Clima is funded. They raise funds in the market, both domestically, but at very high interest rates, and externally with lower interest rates, but an exchange rate risk, right, that they have to deal with. And in a context like that, even though the governments in the South, and we're not seeing just that in Brazil, we're seeing that in Brazil, we're seeing that in South Africa, we're seeing it in Mexico more and more. They are engaged in the agenda of green structural transformation. There are policy agendas that are trying to achieve climate goals while delivering on social and economic development goals, right? The agendas are there. The government has those agendas that I would say broadly align with those multiple challenges that need to be faced. But the public budgets are constrained because of the interest payments that they have to make on their debt on the one side, and their capacity to raise money is also affected by that, and the domestic public finance institutions like BNDES face that problem. In such an environment, and the question is about what's more promising, I think there are 2/3 pathways that I would highlight that have momentum and that are at least an attempt to deliver on the domestic resource mobilization side. One is, of course, taxation, and I think there is a growing momentum for taxation. It's not new. It comes, actually, the global financial crisis, I think, by highlighting inequality and the tax the role that trickle-down economics and the erosion of the tax base at the very top of the distribution. This is a global phenomenon. There is much more. We gained tremendous maturity politically and technically on the taxation debate in countries, in various countries, and because the same way trickle-down economics is something that goes beyond borders, right? There's an incentive to erode your tax base to attract the investments to your region or your state or your country relative to one another. And there is an increase, the financialized world creates way more space for loopholes and evasion and different ways that companies and people and rich individuals find to avoid, right? It becomes not only a domestic issue, but also a multilateral issue in a way that I think makes multilateralism relevant again, because it hasn't been in so many areas, but here it's a clear area where there is both a sovereign domestic agenda on taxing those that are not being taxed in countries, tax reform proposals that try to correct for those injustices, while also understanding that this cannot be done by each country on themselves. Otherwise, the incentives for the tax evasion and those incentives for going somewhere else will undermine the strategy. And so you need tax cooperation in order to secure your domestic national level tax revenue, right? And so here is a clear case. We can talk about the global minimum tax on corporations as an example. Of course, there are many problems with it. Maybe it's not enough what the OECD has proposed, and even there we don't have the US taking part, and now even multinationals, companies from the US are being exempted of even the 15% rate that is really low. But it's one aspect of it. The other aspect of it is, for instance, the Brazilian G20 proposal of taxing the super rich, and which was conceived by Gabriel Zucman and the people in the EU Tax Observatory, and how that connects to also a domestic agenda of taxing the super rich. And Brazil has, I think, understood through its G20 presidency that there was a clear agenda that was an international agenda, but it was also strengthening a domestic agenda. But and I know we will discuss later, so I won't enter the details here, but there's also, I think, the role beyond taxation that two types of institutions have to play. One is the national development banks, and of course I have a colleague from BNDES here, and I think I'll have more chances to talk about the channels that BNDES is finding to be able to finance the green industrialization strategy. Fundo Clima being the most notable, the climate fund that Rafael mentioned. But second, the sovereign wealth funds, and I know JFI is very connected to that agenda, but I think that's another mechanism and complementary mechanism that countries that, at least those that are rich in natural resources, could be deploying more and more towards the climate and transition and their development implications and goals.
Thank you so much, Laura. Pedro, I'd love to turn to you now, to the narrative dimension of these questions, because of course, speculation, volatility, and really investment in general have a huge narrative component. And as the Global Fund for New Economy recently launches, it really powerfully recognizes that. So how can developing countries attract capital inflows without falling further in the sort of fiscalist state constraining trap that we've seen repeated so many times?
Thank you, Maria Fernanda. Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to dialogue with GFI. Well, when it comes to resource mobilization, I would say two or three things around narrative building. First of all, I think we have to shift from the private finance to the public finance. So public banks, public spending, public investment, sovereign funds, multilateral. So shift the discussion towards solutions that are public and not logic-driven, profit-driven. And the idea that the market solution will give us development in developing countries and will give us the solution for the climate crisis, it's a fake idea, right? So we have to think about other solutions. Of course, private flows has also a role to play, but we have to discuss how to regulate that and how to direct that. So historically, private flows generated asset appreciations in the global south, in developing countries, generated exchange rate appreciation, generated consumption booms without structural change behind. So how to direct this towards structural change, towards investment? So and investment is a key word here, and we are talking about the macroeconomic investment. Investment is about new productive capacities, right? And not only new, but the one that replace the old. If we are talking about, I mean, new ways of production, green ways of production, we are talking about investment, right? We are talking about new capacities. And this attraction of private flows also have to be attached with a development strategy. But it's not enough to build this infrastructure in countries if this infrastructure can create new forms of dependency, right? And this is not only debt, it's also import flows. So dependency on new technologies, on other things that we will need to keep this going, right? So a development strategy has to come with an industrial strategy, with technology transfers and so on. So when talking about attracting private flows, all these have to come together, right? The regulation, the development strategy, and so on. And maybe the last thing in terms of narrative framing, it's that we have to rethink fiscal policy, right? We have to reframe it. There's much more room for fiscal policy than people used to say, right? Fiscal policy is about using resources collectively, right? Bringing money from the poor, from the rich to the poor, from the young to the old. And this is a collective decision, right? Who to tax, where to invest, where to spend, where to transfer. Right? This is fiscal policy. And when you say there's no money for that, you are basically saying that the resources are well used, and they are not, right? A country like Brazil doesn't have scarcity of resources. We have an unequal allocation of resources. So there are ways to mobilize resources towards goals, right? And then we have to differentiate from the real fiscal constraints to the imaginary ones, right? So this is an important discussion to do. And the real ones are related usually to foreign debt. And then we have to have a discussion around foreign debt alleviation, right? And the imaginary ones are the ones that are self-constraints, where you have a lot of space to do fiscal policy, public investment, and so on, and you don't do it because you have rules, because you have this technocratic view around fiscal policy, right? So in terms of narrative framing, I think we have to push the discussion towards public, right? And I think it's the moment to do that. There's a lot of people are looking for new things, right? We have to build a new economic paradigm, and that's the role of the Global Fund. The Global Fund for a New Economy has as a mission help to build a movement around a new economy that points out towards a new economic paradigm.
Well, thanks, Pedro. I think that's a great way to finish the first round of questions. We're now moving to the second round, which is what role should public assets play? So a brief intro. At the same time that developing countries are facing this challenging and unjust macro context, we're seeing a broad interest in industrial policy and more open and to more muscular state approaches to organizing capital, mainly by the risk, unfortunately, but some openness to disciplining capital too. And this is happening on public bank balance sheets, of course, but also As a lot of mentioned, sovereign funds, some of them very new ones. We got Altera at the UAE, Gen Zero in Singapore, a new decarbonization fund just launched by the Brazilian state of Espírito Santo. So there's a lot going on in the space. But of course, sovereign wealth funds and public banks are not isolated from the macro challenges that we've been talking about. And they are sites where public and private capital intersect, which is complex even in the best case. So yeah, let's get into it, and I'll start with Laura. So you've recently written about the need for sovereign wealth funds and development banks to work together more closely in pursuit of nationally determined green development objectives. So, how, in your view, should they work together exactly? Is blended finance the right approach? Are credit guarantees or facilities like Brazil's new Eco Invest program to reduce currency risk? No matter the approach, how can we work to make the terms where public and private capital meet more equitable and less extractive?
So I think the question of currency risk is a very central one, and because of course the every possible alternative that we think of here is subject to the fact that the capital is much more costly in the global south than it is in the north, and a lot of it, I'm not saying it's everything. Of course, there are sovereign default problems and other forms of risk that affect those interest rates, but exchange rate is a big one. And I have Pedro here in the panel who studied this in his PhD a long time ago, and there is a big component of the level of the interest rates in countries in the South. Brazil has a 15% nominal rate now. That has to do with exchange rate volatility and exchange rate risk. And so this is indeed a big problem. Foreign loans denominated in dollar are a big problem in terms of creating external vulnerabilities and balance of payment crises and things that thankfully Brazil, as a middle-income country, managed to escape because it holds huge amounts of dollar-denominated reserves, right? So it accumulated a lot of foreign reserves, and today the government, the Brazilian government, is actually holds more reserves than it holds sovereign debt denominated in dollars, much more, which means that every time the dollar appreciates and the real depreciates in Brazil, the Brazilian government net debt actually goes down and not up, right? And that's a very important initial condition for any solutions that we want to propose here, which is what Pedro referred to in a way. It's not a real constraint, right? Then we're talking about constraints that are much more manageable. But that's not the case for many developing countries. I mean, countries that don't access capital markets the same way, that have not accumulated reserves in the past. And I don't need to go to sub-Saharan Africa. We just need to look at Argentina, like a neighboring country that did not manage to accumulate reserves and is therefore subject to IMF negotiations one after the other, that come too little, too late, and do not achieve that long-term sustainability or allow for a growth strategy that is sustainable. Based on that, I think Brazil has created something really interesting now in this current context, and it's not the Eco-Invest program. The Eco-Invest solution is basically a de-risking private sector solution where the government absorbs the exchange rate risk of the private projects because it wants to attract foreign capital for specific projects. So it does biddings, and it basically financial institutions that are taking money abroad through different mechanisms, equity issuances or loans abroad, right? So they get interest rates that are much lower. They come into the bidding and the government is telling them, look, I'm covering your exchange rate risk here. So if the real devalues, public money will go to you in exchange, and that's gonna lower the risk of your project. And so this should be making projects that are now not viable and are constrained by some kind of principles of ESG and other types of taxonomies and other things that make sure these projects are actually in the climate transition. And now I'm hedging the exchange rate risk for you. And that, I mean, I'm not saying that doesn't work. I'm sure, and we lack evidence. It's all very new. We need to see what the composition of projects ended up being, how many of them actually would be viable anyway, because they are really high return projects, and now the government is just socializing the risk while the return is still private return, and like how many projects actually were made viable by this that are in the interest of the public policies in the country. I don't think we have an assessment. We need that assessment to be able to evaluate how effective the program was, but it's a de-risking facility. Same old kind of, privatizing return, socializing risk for exchange rates and private sector projects. The allocation of the projects is made by the private sector. What's really interesting, it's Fundo Clima and the Climate Fund approach. What do? That's the Treasury of Brazil issuing sovereign bonds, sustainable bonds, right? So green bonds. They issue it in international markets, so they are able to pay a much lower interest rate because it's a sovereign issuing the bonds in the market. They are paying a much lower interest rate, but the government is subject to an exchange rate risk, but it holds tremendous amounts of reserves, and so it's protected in its balance sheet. And then it gives the money to BNDES, and BNDES then, based on the government priorities, based on the actual agenda set by the government, gives loans at specific preset interest rates and absorbs the exchange. So the Treasury absorbs the exchange rate risk, but the government is the one that selects the projects that, based on public policies, then make the loans at much lower interest rates than what the private domestic capital market offers. And so that's a state-led approach. There is still an exchange rate risk coverage, but it's directed by a policy agenda, right? And the government BNDES receives the return, part of the return, because they pay off the loans. Of course, they are concessional, but they're set at specific rates depending on what type of project. Renewables, for example, that are really, really profitable and that maybe would happen anyway, pays 8% of interest rates. But then decarbonization of manufacturing, which is much less profitable, pays much less than that. So there's a range of interest rates depending on also the priorities. So I would stress that Fundo Clima is a much nicer story for other countries that are trying to find ways to do this than EcoInvest, at least in principle. But we, of course, still need the evidence and the data, but it's also it's more scalable than the EcoInvest solution.
Off to Pedro again. So what's your take on that question? So I'm especially curious now to hear about your perspective on both EcoInvest and Fundo Clima Climate Fund, given the thinking you're done about exchange rates. I think, if you could elaborate on that a little bit.
I fully agree with Laura. I think EcoInvest is trying to attack the symptoms of a problem that we have in Brazil, the exchange rate volatility, and also the cost of capital, but doesn't attack the causes of this problem. And the causes of this problem are really interesting to discuss, because, I mean, why Brazil has one of the more volatile exchange rate with the US dollar of the whole system? Why Brazil has a 15% interest rate, nominal interest rate? with a 5% inflation, like we have like 10% real interest rate. That's abnormal, right? So, and the conservative view says, well, we have public banks, we have a huge debt, right? A huge deficit, but this is has. I mean, if you look, other countries have more public banks, other countries have more public debt, and has a low interest rate, right? So this is a discussion to be done, right, in Brazil, and this is another thing that we have to go through the narrative discussion, through the changing of the paradigm, because it's a convention that Brazil has to have high interest rates. That comes from the inflationary period that we had in Brazil and the solution that was given to that. And because of the high interest rate, we have a high fiscal cost of this, so in high nominal deficit. And I would say we also have a very volatile exchange rate because the carry trade to Brazil, it's enormous, right? So people take loans at low interest rate here in New York, and then comes to Brazil to have 15% and gain more with exchange rate appreciations. And then when things change, they fly away very quickly, right? So that's why we have a lot of volatility in the exchange rate. And then we have also a deregulation of the exchange rate markets, mainly the derivative markets, that is 5 to 6 times bigger than the spot market, right? So if we want to think a development model in Brazil, we have to attack the macroeconomic problem. So again, we have to think about regulation of those markets, right? And to rethink why we have this abnormal interest rate. So it's much easier. I mean, investors that comes to Brazil, they would say, well, I want 15%. I don't want to have risk in real investments, right? So there's a huge thing about this. Of course, Eco-Invest is not about that. It's about market solution for a problem that is naturalized according to the framework of this, right? And we have to go deeper and try to denaturalize all of those problems, right? That are not only in Brazil. There are other countries. Brazil is a good example, but there are other countries where we have to do this discussion on the macroeconomic dimension of green development.
Yeah, thanks, Pedro. Anyone who wants to get some extra details on how incredibly particular Brazilian monetary policy works can go to phenomenalworld.org. We have been publishing a lot about it. I'm gonna save Rafael to be the last one in this round to wrap up the discussion, and then move to Richard now. So, what's your take here? You've written recently to Phenomenal World, actually, about a new approach to blending from the ground up in this article co-authored by Kevin Gallagher. It was called Restoring Multilateralism. So could you say more about this?
Yeah, but just let me just join in this discussion here, because I think the issue of I think the issue of domestic resource mobilization is critical now for developing countries, and I do worry. The bank, of course, the bank and the fund are now talking about it. They have a very narrow view of it. It's purely fiscal for the bank and the fund. It's about taxation and budgetary procedures and information and good governance. And that we don't want to leave that discussion to the bank and the fund, because we'll get the same discussion about structural change that we get from the structural adjustment was a failure in terms of understanding how you change the structures of an economy, and I fear the same for domestic resource mobilization. I mean, I agree with everything that has been said so far. I think the element that's missing from the domestic resource mobilization story, including this morning, I mean, we're talking about capitalist economies. I mean, we're talking about making this transformation under capitalism, right? That's what, and the vehicle for dynamism in a capitalist economy is profits. And successful capitalist economies, the main source of investment is reinvested profits, still, in almost all countries. And one of the features of the financialized world is the breakdown of the profit investment nexus. And that's true in Brazil. I mean, if you have a 15% interest rate, why would a corporation making profits want to reinvest in its own or related businesses when it's guaranteed a 15% return by taking those profits and putting them there, or as well as putting them offshore in various options. But I mean, that really and Brazil has a domestic investment rate of between 15 and 20%. Which is not the kind of figure that they need to make the kind of transformation that we're talking about. South Africa is another example of an economy with many similar characteristics, I think. And we need to bring those stories into the discussion to get a more comprehensive view of the domestic resource mobilization facing the vast majority of particularly middle-income countries, right? I mean, particularly middle-income countries. On our story, and our story is very much along the lines of what Lara talked about. Is that we focused on development banks, and a reminder that, you know, because they themselves forget that the IMF and the World Bank and the international financial organizations are public organizations. They're public banks. I mean, they're fundamentally public banks. They don't think of themselves in those terms, but they are. And one of the original objectives of an institution like the World Bank was actually to create and support domestic development banks. And they did that in the 50s and 60s as they were operating under kind of more normal post-war norms and values. And that was forgotten and dismissed in many respects, along with the role of domestic development banks, as the World Bank and the IMF moved into a much more neoliberal kind of framing in which they became essentially the handmaidens of private capital, rather than the guarantees of a international financial system and providers of international public finance. And we want to go back to the argument that we try and make in the piece with Boston University is to make a case for public-private partnerships in which multilateral financial institutions again get back to the role of supporting domestic development banks. And in a way, I think the work in Brazil as head of the G20 with the country platforms, I think kind of provided a space for that discussion to materialize, and I don't think it's, you know, the danger, of course, is it will disappear next year, obviously. But I think that discussion has begun. We take 4 or 5 examples of that kind. It's not on the scale that is required, but nor is it absent from the international architecture. And we picked 4 or 5 examples of that kind of relationship between domestic development banks and international development banks as being the kind of models that we want to scale up, and partly for the reasons that Gabriel talked about. You know, the national development banks are the conduit for domestic public policy. They know their economies far better than bureaucrats in Washington know them. And that blending of the public policy agenda with the public finance agenda strikes us as the way in which a kind of real leveraging of resources in the direction that is needed for longer term, patient, non-speculative types of projects is the only way in which we can kind of solve the investment problems that we face.
So Rafael, for last, I had one different question for you actually, but since the discussion took this direction, You are inside an institution. You're working at BNDES. Could you maybe give us an overview on well, constraints or good aspects of platforms such as EcoInvest, such as the Climate Fund, the kind of partnership that Richard was just now talking. How can a national development bank in that context help channel public and private resources to advance national development priorities? Um, and also, do you see currently green objectives and social equity objectives being in tension, or is there alignment in the kind of fund that goes to these two different but actually not different, quite similar goals?
Well, starting with the end, I think when we talk about Amazon and climate investing in the Amazon, it's very hard to separate the environment part and the social part. Because at the end, people were doing deforestation to survive, to have some revenue, some income for the families. So the shift when we talk about stopping deforestation and increasing the value of the forest, standing up, and talking about restoration or the production of bioeconomy products, it works together, the climate part and the social part. We have a lot of small companies, small farmers in these small communities in this region, and they don't understand about exchange rate or the public debt. So we need to arrive in the region with a solution that can help this shift. But this kind of solution will pass through these other discussions. So when we have something like the climate fund that can finance this kind of company, and the initiative to issue the climate bonds, to de-risk this part of this exchange rate, but also help it to increase the budget of the climate fund. The climate fund is operational since 2013, and we always have a problem with the climate fund because of the budget. Because every year we used to have something about less than $100 million. And during some years, because of the public debt, we need to cut this. We do not receive the original money of the climate fund, that because it comes from an oil tax. So when the treasurer decides to issue the stability bond, he increases the budget of the climate fund. So for forest, we have a cap of the size of the project, and we are able to triple this cap and increase the size of the projects, which is very important when we look at the public policy and our goal to reforest in Brazil is a discussion to step up from thousands hectares to million hectares. We are now restoring something around 50,000 hectares. Our goal is 12 million hectares. So it's crucial to increase that. And we need to include the small communities, the indigenous people, the resettlements in this discussion. So it's going to help these families to increase their income with this almost a new sector in Brazil when we talk about restoration and bioeconomy products that come from the forest.
Well, thank you all. We have one final lightning round that is one question for all of you. I think, tweet size kind of answer. That is, so the goal is to align national and multilateral public and private capital to address green development needs. With this goal in mind, can each of you point to one global South-led financial institution, program, regional cooperation model that you find especially promising? I guess we can just follow the order here from.
I mean, one thing which we haven't talked about, of course, I don't know if it's the country or not, is China's role in this story. Because if there's one country that has moved investment resources into the kind of areas and sectors that need to be moved in on scale, it's China. Now, that makes the Belt and Road Initiative an important initiative. There's all kinds of problems with the Belt and Road Initiative, all kinds of problems. But whatever they've done, they haven't followed the logic that has dominated Western thinking for the last 30 years in these areas. They've mobilized public resources. They've disciplined private capital, and private capital plays an important role in this story in China too. There's a whole misunderstanding of that, and they use industrial policy extensively. And you know, we can criticize all kinds of aspects of the Chinese model. We can also criticize its extension through the Belt and Road. But it's at this moment in time, it is offering a hell of a lot more than the multilateral system is offering to most developing countries. And until we absorb the lessons from that experience, both good and bad, I don't think we'll be moving in the kind of direction that we're all talking about on scale in this panel this morning.
So my answer could have been the climate fund, but no one wants to hear about the climate fund anymore. So I'm gonna mention the sovereign wealth fund of Espírito Santo's example. That's a subnational, that's a state in Brazil that is a very oil-rich state, and I think so. The governor of that state created a sovereign wealth fund where the part of the oil royalties are going to. And these funds in the past, they were just strictly financial stability or fiscal stability mechanisms, really. Like the sovereign wealth funds were about avoiding counter-cyclical, pro-cyclical fiscal policy by saving some money when the prices of the oil or other commodities go up, so that whenever they go down, the governments could continue to spend. And this was the main purpose for these funds. Now, I think we're getting to an era, and that this initiative in particular is conceived as that, where these funds became sort of small public development banks. You raise the royalties from oil, you create a fund, and instead of just using that for fiscal stabilization, you actually invest that fund and even catalyze other sources of capital for that fund. So in Espírito Santo, the government puts the money from the royalties, BNDES may come in with another part, the private sector may come in with another part. Actually, we supported that through the Soros Economic Development Fund, so that's the impact investment arm of Open Society, with some money into the same fund. And the idea is that this will catalyze other investors into the fund. And what they're doing with it is that they're looking at an economic diversification strategy away from oil. It's very hard to come to oil-producing countries and say, stop exploiting. I mean, of course, the climate NGOs will be there doing that. But honestly, in most of these contexts, the dependency for fiscal and economic and job of this sector is tremendous. And so the creation of these funds as a tool to channel resources that come from fossil fuels into a strategy that will make that state or that country less dependent on fossil fuel in the future, and by investing this not only on decarbonization and green sectors, but innovation, local innovation, services, other things that could sustain that economy, down the road and make that decision more plausible of move away from it, I think is really interesting. And they're really acting like national development banks or public banks now. And that's what I think we need to encourage, that coordination or connection between sovereign wealth funds and public banks and MDBs as well.
Well, I'm not going to talk about a fund, but a financial instrument that we are trying to structure in Brazil, looking to other sectors like energy and infrastructure that mobilize a lot of money, but how can we replicate that in the forest sector? And to use the logical of a project finance or of take agreements in this kind of project also. And the concessions of public areas in the Amazon are important to that. Almost 1/3 of the deforestation held in conservation units, in public lands. So when the government starts to structure concessions, and we help the governments to structure that, to offer this public land restoration, and we have companies that aim this restoration. I have the Brazilian Climate Fund to finance that, but I still have an issue of guarantees because Brazil, we have a voluntary market, carbon market, and no one can tell what's the value of 1 ton of carbon in 10, 20 years. So when we start developing offtake agreements with companies that want to buy this carbon and the developers that want to sell that carbon, and we can use these offtake agreements as a guarantee for the finance, we help to unlock more investments with the Brazilian Climate Fund. And we also start to bring the insurance sector to the discussion because it's another difference between energy and infrastructure. We do not have insurance for forests. It's very new, it's very incipient. And we need to bring this sector also to this discussion when we start to mobilize that amount of capital.
I will give you a non-simple, non-specific answer. That is the one we are advocating at the Global Fund for a New Economy. So the solution is to build a new economy, right? A new way of organizing society and mobilizing resources, a new way of thinking economic policy, a new way of thinking economic science, and also of sharing economic values. This is also about values, right? There is the Mujica sentence that he says that we have to globalize solidarity to fight indifferences. So this is also about values, right? And sometimes it's easier to get new ideas than to fight and to overcome the old ideas, right? So we have to also fight against this neoliberal framing of every single economic topic, right? So this is an important solution for our problems. So this is my tweet. We have to build a new economy.
There you go. For those of you who don't follow Pedro, no kidding. Now we have a final round of questions. So if anyone from the audience wants to ask anything, we have time for 2 or 3.
Yeah, let's collect 3, but if they could please not be kind of comment/questions, but just the right to the question part.
Tweet size.
Yeah, tweet size, exactly.
Hi, thank you so much. I'm a doctoral researcher at Northeastern. I study the intersection of financial markets and climate risk. Someone at the panel mentioned the concept of initial conditions varying, and that kind of sets the stage up. I noticed that there wasn't a lot of discussion on the role historical colonization has played in setting these initial conditions. I was just curious if that's something that comes across in your calculations or thought processes. I know it's loaded, but yeah.
Hi, my name is Shreyas. I'm with the Net Zero Industrial Policy Lab. I had a question about sort of what national development banks in the global south can learn from each other. The role of national development banks, both at the national and also at the subnational level in India for climate finance is a little underappreciated. For panelists, do you see exchanges at the National Development Bank level between sort of these two economies? Yeah.
One more.
Hi, this is specifically for Laura. You mentioned that the Brazilian government's holdings of U.S. treasuries and dollar-denominated assets is important in Fundo Clima's ability to navigate exchange rate fluctuations. And so I wonder if there is a strategy that can be used similar to Fundo Clima's for countries that don't have such reserves.
Okay. Yeah, we can take one last little appendage.
Sorry, it's a very short question, so I'm going to let you respond. Like, how do you manage to discipline capital? Like you were just juxtaposing the case of China and the West. They discipline capital, but we are disciplined by capital, right? So how do you manage to do that?
Okay, who wants to start?
So I'll take the question on the initial conditions and the reserves. I think for small countries that hardly access international capital markets, it's very hard to tell these countries that they shouldn't be relying on external debt, right? I mean, they don't have an option. It's sometimes. So they need the World Bank, or they need the public international banks that can provide that external financing. And it's sometimes a chicken and egg problem, but it's also size, because sometimes they just don't have the scale and to be able to provide liquidity to those that internally, right, for being able to to issue bonds in domestic currency, right? But that's something that I think it's underestimated, and that we should be doing more work to understand how maybe some countries together, not just each of them separately, but some countries together could get to that initial setting where they are able to issue bonds in domestic currency and have liquid markets that allow them to get into that situation. So that's the first piece. Then there's the reserves themselves. And the reserves themselves, of course, you can accumulate them in the boom years when commodities prices are going up, which is what Brazil did, right? They're still very costly to maintain. I mean, this is money sitting there that they don't pay interest. The interest rates are very low, right? And often there's proposals to use them for something else because they seem like they're just not playing any role. They're just sitting there and with very low return. But from a macroeconomic perspective, given the challenges that we face in this globalized and financialized world, where these countries are subject to these very volatile capitals coming in and out, I mean, that's what avoided that so many crises that could have happened but did not transform themselves in balance of payment crisis that we've suffered in the 80s. Because of that, the fact that we have reserves, that I think it's very hard to even measure what level of reserves are optimal, because these things depend on self-fulfilling prophecies and really crisis dynamics that are hard to measure ex ante. And so I would say that, yes, it's important. But I would also endorse what Pedro said earlier. I mean, there are ways to complement and maybe reduce the need for reserves that have to do with capital account regulation and with avoiding those carry trade, really short-term speculative capital that comes in and out all the time. And like if you had barriers for this capital to come in and out, then maybe you're not as subject to these shocks and don't need as much reserves, right? And so I think there is a need also to discuss these mechanisms, and they need to be coordinated, because if a country on their own decide to impose a capital account regulation, they face tremendous punishment by the markets that end up hiring their cost of capital even more. And so this is something we should be discussing in a coordinated fashion. That's the type of multilateral discussions that we should be having. Finally, on disciplining capital, I think the conditionalities on investment agreements, because we mentioned China here, and the relationship with China is core for that green development agenda everywhere, like the fact that they need the critical minerals and we're reproducing, and here I'll touch on the colonial legacy that is a huge part of all we're discussing here. Of course, now we're in this new era where the climate transition needs some commodities, the new green commodities, the critical minerals, or however you want to call it. They are needed for the climate transition everywhere. The global south produces them, African countries, Latin American countries. They exporting this, and then they might, at best, get some financing for importing the technologies that China and a couple, less than a handful of countries are producing, the US and Germany, right? Maybe. So really, it's a new reproduction of the climate transition is about reproducing old trade patterns where the value addition is happening in a couple of countries and the commodity exporting is elsewhere. So disciplining capital also means having your own policy for adding value and imposing the conditions in that capital that comes in from China, for example, of localizing R&D, transferring technology, doing the things that will allow for you to be able to move up the value chain and seize more value from these transactions, right? So I think that's the core piece here, plus the regulatory frameworks that are needed.
Yeah, just to follow up from what Lara said, I mean, on the reserves question, it is very expensive. I mean, when we did the research on that in UNCTAD, the cost of holding reserves in developing is in the hundreds of billions of dollars. And so it's a major loss of resources for many, and many developing countries have to borrow to build up their reserves. They're borrowing at very high interest rates. They're putting it in maybe treasuries at very low interest. I mean, the cost is very significant, and the fund has failed miserably to come up with a solution to that problem. On disciplining, I mean, ultimately, and the reasons why countries like China can impose discipline even on international firms is that they have relatively closed capital accounts. And they use capital controls. I mean, the threat of exit is the single strongest leverage that large private capital, both domestic and foreign, has over its domestic government policy making. The threat of exit, and the bank. The fund at least has acknowledged there's a role for capital. The capital account management is accepted as because it was part of the original intent of the Bretton Woods system. And it's never gone off the books. There was the attempt to make capital account openness part of the Articles of Agreement back at the end of the 90s. That was defeated, partly due to the Asian financial crisis. So it's still there. I mean, it's a legitimate. These are legitimate tools within the international financial system. The fund and its own internal evaluation unit has made an assessment of the IMF's analysis and promotion, and it says, look, you're just not doing the kind of job that you could be doing by exploring this and recommending this, not as a kind of ad hoc set of proposals, but as part of the toolkit that developing countries should have on a permanent basis to deal with the problem of volatile and highly short-term speculative flows. And getting back to that discussion, I think, is an unavoidable part of the kind of new economy that Pedro is talking about. I don't see that taking place in a world where capital holds that kind of power over domestic governments. On initial conditions and history, look, as someone who came from UNCTAD and that model of development, we understand that the asymmetric power relations are embedded in historical patterns and institutions, and that's true of the multilateral as well as of the domestic. I do think we do have to have right now, though, and it's easy to blame the international system because I've spent most of my life doing that. But at the end of the day, it's the onus is on developing countries to build the kind of domestic institutions that can deliver the policies and the strategies that we are talking about. And that means revisiting the whole discussion about the role of the state, what we've learned and what we've not learned, and what we've learned over the last 30 or 40 years about models that seem to be relevant to the kind of historical legacies developing countries continue to face, and the constraints that they continue to face at the international level. And that discussion, I think, needs to, it does need to, we need to revisit that in light of the kind of circumstances that we now face, and what Laura said, a geopolitical environment that is not going to deliver what developing countries need. That discussion has to take place, I think.
I'm going to change to the second question. I don't know if you want to comment a lot. No? Well, about your question with the NDBs, we have an association of national banks which exclude World Bank and NDB. They don't love us for that, but only the national banks are together. We started aligning some reports and green taxonomy and things like that. But now we have some discussion groups where we exchange best practice, discuss about instruments, and we discuss about GCF, and one bank help another to access GCF. No, it's not easy to access money from the Green Climate Fund, but to help and talk directly to GCF as a association. It's called IDFC, okay? And we are there, KfW, FD, the BSA, and JAC, FMO. We are together in this association. Okay.
Financing Parliament's initiative in that context, I think, is one that should be flagged, because I think that's made a difference to discussion amongst public. It's more public banks in general, and including international. But that was the French Development Agency, and that was a valuable, I think, contribution. Sorry.
It's just for the Zoom folks.
Just two short comments. On international reserves, I think international reserves are kind of a price countries pay for this, to play the game of globalization, right? So we are in the crisis of globalization. So we have to find new ways out of this. So, and then there is a debate on trade in local currencies, currency swaps, running out of dollar, going out of the dollar and have alternative currencies. So this is a debate that we should do, right? And countries that are in the short term are facing crisis and don't have reserves, we also have to have a deep discussion on debt alleviation and debt cancellation, right? I was in Kenya some weeks ago, and what IMF is doing there is unbelievable. Like, it's a financial bill. They are raising taxes on food to pay the IMF. It's incredible. So there is a discussion to be done around this. And the second thing I wanted to say, it's around the public banks and how important is BNDES for Brazil's development, and how could public banks could play an important role for that. It has been more before, right? We had like a state ownership, we call it a state ownership law in Brazil that changed the rules of the game during Bolsonaro and Temer's administration. But when we talk about development, and development here is structural change, not growth. Development is not, you can have growth without development. I mean, you have a commodity boom, so your country gets rich, but you don't change the structure, right? You have the same consumption structure, have the productive structure, and so on. So development is about structural change. And development, it's not only an issue of fiscal policy, or macroeconomic policy, or it's a whole thing. It's how to coordinate things, right? And in South America, we had development using state-owned companies, using public banks, using also trade policy, exchange rate policy, and so on. So how we can re-legitimate this discussion around development, bringing this whole instrument together, right? So this is an important discussion, how to bring back and to renew the discussion on development.
Yeah, thank you, Pedro. I think that was a great way to wrap it up. So development is not a natural result. Development comes from having a development project. Well, thanks everyone on the panel. Thanks everyone who's here.
So, this was such a good discussion that we couldn't cut it off. But of course, now we have sort of blown through our break time. So if it's all right, maybe we could just take 5 minutes to move a bit, have a coffee, a pastry, use the bathroom, and then we'll reconvene at 10 after. 5 minutes. Thank you.
That is a tough act to follow, but I think that we are up to the task. Thank you again to Maria and our last panelists for an engaging discussion on a very timely topic. For those of you that don't know me, I'm Jonah. As the mineral and energy economist at JFI, I lead our critical minerals portfolio of research. And yes, mineral economists do exist, though we are few. Revenues generated from extractive sector taxation have long been an enabler of the public finance solutions that were just explored. And in the context already highlighted, as well as one of retreating foreign aid and increasingly transactional diplomacy, mobilization of these revenues is essential in executing green development objectives. Meanwhile, the energy transition, AI, and global development are expected to greatly expand both the scope and scale of mineral demand, representing a key opportunity for the countries that produce these minerals. However, mineral extraction is fundamentally different from oil and gas production, and so too are the opportunities afforded to producer countries. Primary extraction revenues are a fraction the size of oil and gas. The sector is capital intensive, slow moving, and very sensitive to a myriad of risks. At the same time, while oil and gas supply chains are relatively short, minerals are inputs to long and complex supply chains that accumulate value as they enable products lasting 10 to 30 years with potential for recycling and reuse. Think of electric vehicles and their supply chains or semiconductors, for example. So phrased differently, the primary forms of minerals are worth only a small fraction of the total value of the products that use them. And thus, minerals-based industrial policies seeking to downstream in energy transition value chains have become a key objective for producer countries, and in some cases, necessary to justify extraction. But how host countries choose to design extractive sector taxation and minerals-based industrial policies has important implications for the scale of resource mobilization, broader economic spillovers, the timing and duration of benefits, and the potential to translate temporary extractive sector booms into lasting development outcomes. The objectives of both areas, designing robust tax regimes and effective industrial policy, can also be fundamentally at odds. So we've gathered a diverse group of thought leaders today, all experts in their respective fields, to explore these questions specifically, and I am honored to facilitate a discussion with them today. So here we have Clarkson Kamarai, who is the Critical Minerals Program Manager at the Payne Institute at the Colorado School of Mines, and a PhD student in the Mineral and Energy Economics Division. He has over 18 years of experience in mining engineering and mining finance across sub-Saharan Africa and South America, specializing in process improvement, energy metals, decarbonization, and circularity. His career includes leadership roles in mining and consulting, as well as work with Codelco and Anglo American on deep-level mining technologies. Thomas Lessu leads the International Institute for Sustainable Development's work on tax and extractives and manages the Global Mining Tax Initiative. An economist with over 15 years of global experience in public finance, tax policy, and mining governance, he has advised governments, trained officials, and built partnerships with organizations such as the OECD, the African Tax Administration Forum, the Asian Development Bank, and the Inter-American Center of Tax Administrations. He previously worked at the Natural Resource Governance Institute on technical assistance programs in Guinea, Mozambique, and Burundi. Rosana dos Santos is the executive director of the E+ Energy Transition Institute with over 30 years of experience in the energy sector, including executive roles at Enel, GE, and EDP. She served as an advisor to the Brazilian Wind Energy Association for 13 years and as project coordinator at the Ministry of Mines and Energy, and has conducted research at leading institutions in Brazil, Germany, France, and the UK. An electrical engineer with a master's and doctoral degree in energy from the University of Sao Paulo. She is also a member of the United Nations Council of Engineers for the Energy Transition and a voluntary lecturer at several universities. And finally, Gilberto Garcia Vasquez is chief economist at DataWheel, where he leads data-driven initiatives focused on economic complexity, industrial development, and green growth. With a career spanning public policy, academia, and the private sector, he has advised governments and international organizations on economic diversification, sustainable development, clean energy, and innovation policy. His work translates complex data sets into actionable insights that inform public policy and advance economic transformation. His analysis has been featured in the New York Times, the Washington Post, and most importantly, Phenomenal World. So before we dive into the discussion, I just wanted to take a second to acknowledge that we've set this conversation up to be uniquely technical, and the advantage is that we'll get into critical details around value creation, taxation, and downstreaming that I find are often missing from current dialogues. The downside is that this does necessitate a narrow view on the role of minerals in development, when and where extraction should occur, or whether it should occur at all, and how to mitigate and manage the consequences of extraction, especially around indigenous rights, are equally important topics that will be noticeably absent from this conversation. 1 hour is hardly enough time to explore the topic at hand, let alone the many layers of this multifaceted subject. So I thank the speakers and the audience for their understanding here. And with that, let's begin our discussion at the upstream. Clarkson, can you highlight how mineral extraction may benefit the host country in and around the mine, apart from direct revenues generated, such as taxation and royalties? And what challenges have you seen that can kind of mute these potentials in practice?
Thank you, Jonah. Thank you, Jonah. Hello, everyone. Mineral, basically extraction, especially if you're looking in the global south, look, one thing we have realized, or one thing you will notice, by the way, I'm from, from the Southern African region. And so mining is basically in our, it's like in our bloodline. But one thing you realize that development patterns or human settlements, basically you can almost map, also they mimic the mineralization that is in the, in those areas. So you will find basically almost every town that is a major development node has been or was started, basically as a mine. And therein lies the fact that at least mining has been the driver that has driven, most of, what we call development. And with that, there has always been a higher burden or expectation that is put on a mine developer, in the sense that you are not just having a narrow bandwidth where you're looking at yourself, I'm here to extract, ship stuff out, get my profit and go. But the bandwidth is much higher, the expectation is much higher. And so what we have kind of experienced now is that with the shift towards more maybe profit-driven kind of initiatives, there's been this battle between what governments are expecting or and what miners think they should be getting out. So for us, when we are doing development, we have realized that there is a new change altogether in terms of what you have to do before you are given license to operate. And one of those things is that it's just not for you to satisfy the fact that obviously you have done your bankable feasibility, this happens bankable, I can go. But then there's this other social economic, part of it that basically says, okay, fine. What are you going to do? Is it just, when talking about salaries, when talking about just jobs, that's a given. But we need to understand, the spillover effects, as they call them. Okay, fine. What is actually, how is this community going to be better off than they were before you started, doing this mining and stuff like that? And so that's the one thing that we now have to address. And you will find that there are different, what they call mining codes that you have to kind of at least comply with. And they basically talk to the social issues, socio-economic issues, and the fact that if I'm employing 3,000 people, I need to understand that at least 3,000 people, maybe there's a 5-time multiplier effect because of families and other things and other jobs that come out of that support that. So, look, maybe I can give you an example just to show you what's, what now at least, the benefits that are accruing out of, out of a mining setup. We in Zambia, for instance, in the Northwest province, we have we have got an area called, there's First Quantum. First Quantum went into a bush that was 300 kilometers away from the last mine. They actually had to set up a new mine. And in there, all the government could do was give them a license and they to develop a road. They to, you put in an airstrip, put in a hospital, put in all those things. Those are things that the new miner is doing. The challenge with that is that this then tends to exclude your junior miner because the junior miner does not have the bandwidth to do all that. And you will find that most of the junior miners now, what they're doing is just to come in, explore, find a deposit, and then they come to places like this, and then they they float that project. Looking for an Anglo-American, looking for a bigger player. Problem with that is that then ordinarily for you to be given all that, to be allowed to go and explore and find that they make certain concessions with communities, with the regional leaders to say, this is what I would do and everything. And there's that, mismatch or lack of handover now to say to the new developer who is coming to say, listen, this is what I committed to already. And that's one area we have seen where there's conflict. Conflict is, has risen, and there's been this back and forth that has happened where it has delayed projects. That's the social aspect. And then the other issue also is that because of this energy transition and this new push towards, look, we believe that at least demand is going to increase in terms of all the so-called critical minerals. With that, you find that at least look at this, we need to develop more. So the exploration pipeline or the project development pipeline is lengthened. The quality of the deposits that we are having right now is falling, is basically falling. So that is, that is introducing a strain. And as a result, there's a lot of, there's a danger that at least there could be cutting of corners, a higher generation of waste, because now you are doing more. You are basically producing more, but you're also mining lower grade ores that then generate, that. So these are some of the, the issues that we are seeing with that. But I think the most important thing is that, like I said, is the expectation on the miner, and I think generally the miners have taken that on board, and in terms of realizing that I'm not here just to develop, the ore just for myself. You have this expectation that is then placed on you, and you actually have to service that.
Yeah, thanks a lot for those points. I mean, there's a lot to unpack there, but one point I see is sort of this discussion around the burden of development, and whether that should be on the miner, which types of miners are capable of that development. But one way to a key area to sort of transfer that burden of development from the miner to let's say, the government at different scales is the fiscal regime, which is turning to your expertise, Thomas. So, now that Clarkson has talked about the non-fiscal side, can you describe for us sort of the principal mechanisms through which host countries retain revenues from mining, and why here is proper design so important, especially in the mineral sector? And then, to that end, in what ways have you seen these tax bases eroded in practice? And what strategies have you seen successfully implemented to protect these essential domestic resources? Yeah.
Thank you, Jonah, and thanks, Clarkson. Thanks for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here. So it's a good question. I would start maybe with probably the first principle with the taxation of natural resources is the fact that these resources in most countries are owned by the state and managed by the state on behalf of its people. So there's a role of being a steward, for the state being a steward of those resources. And as such, there's a duty to maximize how much financial benefits it collects when they're extracted. These resources are non-renewable. And so if it's missed for the first time, there's no second chance. These resources are lost forever. So it's an important principle in resource taxation. And that's why a lot of those mechanisms to collect revenues are trying to collect the so-called mineral rent. So mineral economists like yourself take a lot of stake and pain to define it. And the idea is that the government should be entitled to all of the benefits that accrue to mining companies, producers, once they've recovered all of their costs. There's a surplus that comes from the fact that minerals have commodities prices that are set externally, and that can go way above the cost of production. And so to do so, governments typically have relied on a traditional mechanism called tax royalty system. So it's based on mineral royalties, often collected on a share of the value of the resources, and corporate income tax. So the same tax that's applied to all corporations. It hasn't done a great job at collecting that mineral resource rent. So it's been tweaked and tailored, and it comes in all kinds of flavors in different countries across the world, so that there's no two identical fiscal regimes between countries. So in addition to these two instruments themselves that can be tweaked themselves, royalties can be based on profits, can be based on the value of sales, can be based on production, can vary according to different index prices. There's another number of other instruments as well. So a lot of countries now impose a local development tax, often to fund local development projects, and it's typically based on the value of sales, on the turnover. There are often taxes or duties on exports of minerals or imports of goods and services that come into the production process. You have a lot of countries, especially in sub-Saharan Africa, now require a share of the equity stake in companies to be owned by the state, often without contribution. So it's ended up being an additional payment on the net profits. And you have withholding taxes on cross-border payments that multinational companies undertake. And some countries have also adapted different kinds of windfall profit taxes or resource rent taxes that try to go a bit beyond those instruments and really try to capture that mineral rent. So there's a lot of different forms. And recently, we also seen many countries try to go a bit beyond that traditional model of royalty tax system to completely different structures to collect revenue. So you've seen joint ventures, often involving state-owned companies. There was the first wave in the 60s and 50s, 70s. Now they're coming back. There's a number of countries that are piloting production sharing contracts. So just like in oil and gas, where the state keeps the ownership of the resources and finds a contractor to do the investment and operating for them. The same thing is happening in the mining sector at a very small scale for now, but could be clearly there's a lot of interest in those. And we've explored that in a report called The Future of Resource Taxation, if you're interested. Now, one of the issues, and you mentioned it in your question, it's around actually collecting those revenues, and especially if they're based on profits, can be quite challenging, as ensuring that adequate value of the tax base is not always easy. There's the first challenge of ensuring that the quantity and the quality of the minerals that are extracted and sold eventually abroad is adequately reported to the authorities. So that requires quite a bit of regulations and measurements, skills on the side of the government. But more important is often what goes into the whole category of BEPS, base erosion and profit shifting. So all the mechanisms that multinational companies are able to use to minimize their taxes they owe at the in the production country, in the host country. You have transfer pricing, so how the prices they set to different branches of the multinationals across border. They can take advantage of the tax treaty network to take advantage of better conditions and find loopholes in the domestic tax system through these international transactions. So there's a lot that can happen there, and it's resulted in a lot of frustrations in host countries that they weren't collecting the revenues they were expecting. If you forecast in the typical tax royalty system, you forecast how much revenue should be collected at the country level. You typically find that profit-based taxes, corporate income tax should be the 70–80% of the total amount of revenue collected by the state. But in practice, a lot of countries in developing economies don't collect that at all, and they end up relying a lot more on royalties, which are supposed to be a much minor part of the fiscal regime. So it's not. There are solutions. It's not always. There's a lot of solutions and some good experiences we can share. First of all, I would say there's two levels of solution. The first one, you can think about it, if you think about the tax base at the country level as a bucket with leaks, and lots of all the leaks are loopholes in the tax system or international tax system that companies are taking advantage of. So the first strategy is to plug those holes, one by one. It takes time, but there's a number of things that work, improving transfer pricing regulations, designing proper rules on ring fencing so that companies declare taxes by mining project and not in aggregate. You have ways to limit how companies can take advantage of international tax treaties, and a number of other elements to do that. That can lead to, for some countries that start with big holes in their buckets, that can make a big difference, and you can find some so-called quick wins. For example, in Guinea for a long time was exporting bauxite. Companies had set up shop and were exporting bauxite to other countries where it was being refined at prices that were way below the market prices. So a quick fix was for the government identifying that problem and putting a benchmark, a floor on what prices should be declared by companies. That can represent, if properly implemented, up to over $200 million per year for the country. So that's a quick fix. Another one is that countries which have capital gains tax on the transfer of mining licenses. You mentioned junior companies, sale licenses, often at a profit to major companies. That can be taxed. But if the transfer is done offshore, so it can be hidden and not declared to the local authorities, and that can be a big loss for the company. So that's also a quick fix. You have capital gains rules in your country. Just make sure the rules extend to offshore transactions and with enforcement mechanisms that go with it. But unfortunately, a lot of the solutions are not quick wins. They're like slow wins, and it takes a lot of efforts. And so in addition to plugging all these different holes, having better regulations on all of these BEPS issues, you also need to build up the capacity of your tax administration and other institutions in charge of collecting the revenue. It takes time, but if you see, I can mention the examples of both Zambia and Mongolia, two important copper producers. They identified transfer pricing in mining as a big problem, BEPS issues back almost 10 years ago, and they tried to follow some of the best practice on improving their domestic tax system, on getting expertise from working with international organizations, and building their internal capacity in the tax audit department on transfer pricing. So it started in 2017. It took a few years to put that together. They started the first mining tax audits on transfer pricing audits in the around 2020, 2019. And it takes 1, 2, 3 years to get to the actual results. But in the last 2 years, both countries have assessed transfer price, new tax, have made tax assessments to those to companies worth over $200 million for Mongolia and at about $150 million for Zambia. So there is real money at stake if you take the pain of following those strategies. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Thomas. Yeah, and these are significant, sort of the revenues that can be captured. It's quite significant, but at the same time, while that tax revenue generated from the extraction, even when those loopholes are closed, still the export of the primary commodity misses out on the downstream manufacturing potential that these materials can enable. And so, Hosanna, here, can you discuss the research you've been doing in the case of Brazil, and perhaps more broadly, what mineral producing countries can consider in developing their downstreaming policies around critical minerals? It may be worth highlighting your work around power shoring and to defining what that means for those unfamiliar. Yeah. Thanks.
Yeah, first, thank you for inviting me. This is like a wonderful discussion. The panel before was really good, and it's an honor for me to be here with all of you. And it's also an honor to be in a panel full of economists, and I'm the only engineer. See, it's quite different. Usually it's the opposite, but it's the only female and the engineer one. So I'll try my best. So I'll start my observations here by what Pedro was saying in the previous panel, saying that we have to find a new economy or rethink development somehow, and also to try to fight that the boom of commodity stays as a boom of commodities and actually turns into a structural change in a country's economy. And this has everything to do with the research that we've been carrying out, both in Brazil and also with some partners in Latin America. Still not with Mexico, but soon we will. It has everything to do that realizing something that I heard a lot on our first day of discussion is that mining is beyond an environmental problem per se. It's also a problem, a social problem. It brings a lot of violence and other things together. So we have to be able first to do this in a sustainable way, but add value closer to where the mining is. Because by adding value, you can also help to have, I don't like this expression, but to have the fiscal space to do something in the country, and also to get those families and that regional economy to a better place. So how to add value in a world that is organized around commodities, is organized about cost effectiveness of supply chains, and does not actually take care of what is going on the mining space. My answer to that is climate. And why? Because when you start taking into account the emissions during the refining phase, which is largely overlooked when we see it. So just for you guys to have an idea, nickel, it's concentrated in Indonesia and China. So nickel processed, the refining phase in those two countries emits more than 500 tons of CO2 per ton, per ton of nickel. And if this refining were done in a large renewable country as ours, or Colombia perhaps, this would be 30. So it does matter. And I heard that in other discussions a lot about the value is not at the refining phase. This is not true. In our opinion, who dominates the refining phase actually dominates the supply chain. So geopolitically speaking, placing ourselves at the refining phase or further, it's geopolitically interesting for us to gain some power in those supply chains and not be subject to only commoditized prices. I'm not saying this is a war, but I'm just saying strategically speaking, we have to position ourselves further in the supply chain, either refining or a little bit further. Bringing a very clear example, and this begins with a report, or it's yesterday, Germany launched a report saying that they will never be competitive in the solar panel supply chain again, because the energy intensive part of the supply chain will never be competitive. So this is just some other thing, just saying the same that we've been saying, that for the supply chain, the solar silicon supply chain, for example, it would be beneficial for a country like Brazil to position itself to supply, instead of supplying silicon or quartz or metallurgical silicon to position itself for supplying the polysilicon or even a little bit further to a country that will never be able to get those energy intensive part of the supply chain in a greener way. Because if we are to account carbon in a correct way, we will count carbon from the very beginning and not just position the frontier where you are counting carbon according to your technological or industrial interest. So if we are to decarbonize this is a very complicated word, decarbonize the world, we have to take it seriously into account scope, not only scope 1, but 2 and 3 as well. And if we start counting scope 2 and 3, it's obvious that we have to get the energy intensive parts of the supply chains closer to where the resources are. And for mining, this is clear that we have to go into refining or a little bit further in South Africa, in Brazil, or wherever the minerals are, or in Chile, wherever the minerals are. So in a nutshell, this is what we call, I'm going to be very philosophical here. We are calling this not only power shoring, because it's not only about power, it's a lot about where the main resource of a certain supply chain is. We are calling it a new consensus, the Belém consensus, referring to COP30 in Belém. You're all invited. But what we mean by that is that we take an old way of the economy to organize itself, the Washington consensus, which is kind of dead for some time now. We are just struggling to recognize it. And we add a layer of social impact, and we add a layer of the environment to those cost-effectiveness way to organize the supply chains. And then you have the Belém consensus, meaning it's decarbonizing a supply chain at the same time of creating more jobs, quality jobs, closer to where the resources are, adding value closer to where the resources are, distributing wealth, distributing the problems of mining that are not neglectable, and by this, doing what we call the real just transition. Meaning, just transition is not only about transitioning people that work on the fossil fuel and having everybody, providing access to everybody to clean energy, because this is actually not transition, this is a humanity obligation, but anyhow, we just disguise this as transition. But the real just transition is adding real value and quality jobs to closer to where the resources are and away from the usual suspects a little bit. So this is the new economy, how we see the new economy, how we see power shoring and consensus de Belém integrated to this critical mineral thing. And also, this is how we see that this global south should start positioning itself when negotiating trade agreements and not just falling into the quick money that comes from only taxation at the mining stage. And sorry, it's just reminded me, just one more thing. What we see, at least there in Brazil, perhaps you can add other examples, is that companies, mining companies like Sigma, I don't know if Camila from Sigma is here. No, she's not. They are being asked to think about adding value to their mining expertises. This is not fair with the mining company. It's not their expertise or even their obligation to think that. The obligation to think that is from the public. It's a public policy, it's an industrial policy. So we have to have industrial policy, energy policies, and mining policies come together in an integrated planning way and think together where is the sweet spot that that particular country can claim to be in nickel or polysilicon or lithium, any particular critical mineral supply chain. It's this lack of integrated planning and just relying on the mining companies to come up with, I don't know, some crazy idea on how to add value. This is not fair, even with the mining companies. We have to have some industrial policy embedded in it.
Well, that's actually a good transition to Gilberto, but I will, take just wanted to mention quickly that I think it's a really strong perspective. And we often find, I mean, you mentioned the energy intensity of refining. We often find that as also a key limiting factor in many regions that are seeking to develop this downstream capacity, but also framing that where there is low carbon electricity, framing it also as an opportunity in your work, I think is quite strong. So, and, you know, coming back and zooming out a bit, you know, kind of to the direction that you went there, you know, at the core, minerals-based industrial policy is a strategy for economic diversification. And the motivation for diversification is clear, but there are very complex challenges to implementing successful industrial policies in practice. So, Gilberto, can you speak to some of the broader challenges and how the frameworks of economic complexity can enable policymakers to be more strategic about sort of those highest potential products to pursue in this context? And, you know, also in your experience, what are some of the sort of limitations of this approach? Yeah.
Yes. First, thank you for the invitation. It's wonderful to be on this conversation with such an expert and in this most relevant topic. I want to take a little different perspective on this, and my point is that when countries discover critical minerals, the instinct normally is simple, right? We have the rock, let's build the battery, let's make the battery. My note of caution with this is that in long, heavy knowledge chains, value doesn't follow the rocks, it follows capabilities. So if you skip those steps in building those capabilities, downstreaming can become a deadly close end, and it can actually drain the resources that you need to climb into diversification and economic structure higher. As I was saying, like I take that perspective of economic complexity, and in this way, just think about the economy as a toolbox of routines, right? You have trained people, you have supplier networks, you have quality systems, logistic controls, certifications, after-sales service. These routines accumulate, they stick, and they can be reused. So in a network, like if you think an economy then as a network, in a network of products, goods that reuse similar routines sit close to each other. So countries diversify by taking nearby steps, not wild leaps from critical minerals to batteries. Nearby, but we cannot make the mistake of thinking nearby as something like suboptimal. Like nearby doesn't mean low tech, it just means feasible next. Economic complexity in this case, in this way, can be, or ESI can be a compass in this process, right? Because it measures how broad and unique your toolbox is. Countries that have larger toolboxes grow faster because they can continually add more complex capabilities and activities to their economies. So something that, you know, when I listen and I always also have caution with that is that we shouldn't picture a ladder like mining to refining to battery. I think we should, and in that way of rethinking the economy and how to deal with this, we should picture the economy or this as a climbing wall. You have many holes that are within reach from where you are at a certain point, and then others that you can reach later after a few moves. And then you have a rope, right? That is your fiscal space that can help you, that you must manage carefully on your way up. Part of the work that we have been doing with these perspectives in different countries, I'm gonna just take the example of Mozambique that is very representative of these challenges for countries like ours. In Mozambique, over 60% of its exports depend or come from just a few products, aluminum, coal, and gas. These products are important because they earn foreign exchange, but they act like enclaves, right? Like they are capital intensive, they are import heavy, and they offer few linkages to the rest of the economy. You don't see those linkages there. So revenues rise and fall with global prices, but the toolbox that these countries have, it doesn't expand with those revenues and those activities. So there, like I'm gonna offer like two optional alternatives to that, right? Like two footholds that show a different path. First, fertilizer blending. Mozambique has already firms active that are active in that space, but they rely on imported phosphates and potash, but they could increase or integrate domestic gas-based urea and add micronutrients. Exports of this product in Mozambique are still small, like $20 million per year, but regional demand for this product is huge, right? And there are several studies showing that, you know, when you add these micronutrients on that are very soil specific for these regions, agriculture benefits substantially. So, but more importantly, this kind of production builds routines like in chemical processing, formulation, and quality control. So those are the capabilities you continue adding to improve your economy. Second, aluminum scrap. Mozambique smelts around 350,000 tons of aluminum next year, but only recovers a third of that on the scrap. So a modest remelt facility can capture the value and supply that value and supply auto and construction buyers that normally for this kind of products are premium buyers in markets that pays an overprice. So this is it's a product that maybe is not glamorous, but it builds recycling logistics, metallurgic routines, and access to premium markets. So together, these steps expand not just exports, but the toolbox that countries have to expand in routines that is built into food processing, consumer goods, mid-tech manufacturing, and that's how countries go beyond the rock, because they start producing the things that they need the most, and they start substituting the imports that are also draining their resources and building those capabilities that go beyond the critical minerals that they have. So how do you figure out that, right? Like how do you figure what that could be the right steps on this process? The work that we have been doing lately is using an optimization method. I'm a data nerd and I have the bias. So that is that optimization method is the we call it SE optimization. So what you do is you set a target for an SE or that growth rate that is equivalent to that SE, and then you select a portfolio of new activities that can reach that target while minimizing effort. By effort is defined as the additional revealed competitive advantage, or RCI, that an economy must build, and then stepping stone years so the model can predict a specialization by the target year. Let's say that you want to grow at a 5% by 2035. So that's how that specialization model has a stepping stone year. Then you have a certain level of effort that you already reached. So then you can optimize your production later on. So this algorithm, what it does is minimizes the RCA increase needed to reach a target product complexity or the basket of products that you have. So you are not only depending on those three products that are, again, capital intensive, import heavy, and that they are not split into the rest of the economy, but you are building the products that can lead you to a more manufactured-based, knowledge-intensive economy. So in practice, what this is doing is ranking candidate activities on a complexity cost plane. So you start with things that are, as I said before, close by, right? Like high complexity, low effort picks, but then add items that until it reaches the SE target. And the results that you get with this optimization method is very interesting because it is a balanced portfolio where you have related and unrelated activities, and that then kind of guide or map the opportunities that you can reach. So of course, this has biases, and it has things that are important to consider, most of them related with the context that you are putting on, right? Like, because it is true that for some countries, moving from critical minerals to refining, it is possible and desirable, and it also has a geopolitical consideration that you have to take into account. But that's very context specific, right? So they are considerations that you have to take in terms of the fiscal rope, right? You have to protect revenues with tight incentives, clear milestones when you are financing development in this way. You have to have a grid reality or infrastructure reality, and asking yourself if these products that you are considering as a diversification strategy, if you have the energy, the infrastructure that can support their production, and market access. A factory without contracts, without certifications is just a white elephant, right? So support must follow a demand, not only the construction of a specific building. So this will be a summary that I will leave with you. My take will be use minerals to finance the climb, but climb by building footholds of capability and routes to market. That's how countries move beyond the rock and keep the value in the transition.
Yeah, thanks a lot. I mean, I just want to emphasize actually that analogy of a ladder versus a climbing wall, because we tend to think about this in a very linear way and actually map it in dialogues in a very linear way. But it's much more like this network, right? And thinking where it's strategic to move along this network. And that also speaks to actually the sort of difficulty in executing it. Anyone who's climbed here knows that it's much more difficult than climbing a ladder. So I appreciate that analogy. And also, you know, another thing I want to emphasize that you said there was sort of the capacity and strategy that we need, to even identify the opportunity, but then also to move into the execution. And you were talking about, you know, the changing, like how we the Washington consensus or the Lang consensus as you were, you know, proposing. But you know what we've seen is even in countries where perhaps there is strong regional demand, like let's say for smelting in Zambia around copper, there's this lack of coordination and capacity to connect even the producers with the midstream. So I think you know, we're using these strategies first to identify and then considering, okay, where do we need to be equally strategic in supporting and enabling that network to grow. And to that end, I wanted to give both Clarkson and Hosanna the chance to react to what you said from their experience sort of implementing or working with some of these industrial policies on the ground. You know, I mean, you know, my bias is towards sort of the understanding what are the critical technical questions that need to be addressed to kind of supplement that data-driven analysis that Gilberto outlined. But yeah, I just kind of want to give you the chance to react and to respond to those comments.
Yeah, sure. You know, one interesting thing about this, you know, analogy of either climbing or going up the ladder. One thing you realize that at times you know, at least, okay, fine, you gave the example of Mozambique, very interesting. But however, you know, there's also the issue of competitive advantages that the individual countries within a bloc, like for instance, Mozambique belongs to SADC, and SADC basically controls about 40 to 50% of the so-called critical minerals. And one of those is not, say, aluminum, for instance. Aluminum is cheaper and easier obtained, say, from you know, the guys in the north in ECOWAS. So ECOWAS will have, you know, it is dominance there. You get it much cheaper. That's one. Two, Southern Africa also has a big problem currently of energy deficiency. So despite the potential for a lot of hydro projects, those hydro projects have just remained on paper. So that kind of limits it to what it can do. One thing that, funny enough, the region has been talking about, and we are in conversation right now, you know, it's like at the Penn Institute trying to talk to the African Development Bank as well as the ASC, you know, FT, the trade arm of the AU, is to look at a regional integration as opposed to individual countries. Because when you do that, you tap into their strengths, and as a bloc, they become much more powerful. Consider South Africa, like what we're talking about. South Africa has got midstream and maybe further, you know, it is downstream capabilities that now are actually being hamstrung by this power crunch that's in. And I think you've been seeing the news, Anglo-American, BHP, and all these guys. They've been a steady but assured exit going for the door. And one of the key reasons is this idea that you cannot actually be productive, in terms of the operating hours for me as a miner. I'm a mining engineer, by the way. So yeah. So one of the things that we value a lot is my shifts. I need my full shifts to get my ore out. That's how I pay my people. That's how I make money. And if I have to be put on this black thing whereby, okay, fine, for 15 hours, that's what we're going to give you. That's just, that's not sustainable. We still have the good grades. Right now in Chile, they're mining 0.5%, 0.6% copper. In the Congo, we are sitting with 6%, sitting on the rock pile dump. And you know what it does? It impoverishes Congo because it's difficult. Once I mine something, I need to put it in a plant and get it out. And if I'm stockpiling it there because I have to go for a higher grade that pays up, then the premium is higher, and that just doesn't work. So these are all things that Africa is grappling with. So like what you're saying to say, okay, fine, look for what is critical. Yes, fine. So these are things that we're looking at. We're looking at, for mining to work, we need that unlocking infrastructure that is required. One of them is energy. We are energy deficient. And once you get that, you can go to the next step in terms of beneficiation, because all this beneficiation requires energy, and we don't have the energy. And that, I think, to me, this second round, when everyone's crying about critical minerals, I think the Global South needs to be careful about that, to say, okay, fine, what is that development that I think is critical for mining to work? And then the question we are posing currently, which we are trying to discuss, is critical minerals for development, or development is for critical minerals? The idea being, we believe that critical minerals should be a lever that then unlocks the development. And it's not necessarily that it has to be full-on industrialization, but we need to move away just from the idea that I can only mine and ship, because that's always going to make me tied again to the vagaries of commodity price swings and all these things, and it just doesn't work. And I think for me, I really like that analogy, but I think I'm just cautioning that at least that's the challenge. For someone like me coming from the region, I do understand what has faced me when I'm developing a mine, the decision that I have to use in my DCF when I'm trying to say, should I go, should I not go? These are some of the things that I look at, and it just throws all these things. And lastly, the other issue is this thing about institutions and structures. This is one thing that has killed the Global South. We do not have strong institutions, and therefore some of these things are very good. We have got good policies, like we're talking about Mozambique. Mozambique and South Africa, they're basically changing, gas, the Mozal line, the one that you're talking about, at least from that, actually, the thing comes from us out of Sasso, which is a fossil fuel plant in South Africa that pushes up its gas to the aluminum plant. And with that, right now, let's look at it, it's suboptimal, and therefore it's becoming so inefficient, and no one is actually doing anything like what you're talking about, at least in terms of the market. You can produce something unless you have the whole chain sorted out. You are just stuck with it because there's someone else next door who is doing it better. So the issue of regional integration and regional blocks, competencies, where you're strongest. We've always been saying we have copper, we have cobalt. We literally dominate 80% of the cobalt supply chain. We dominate 90% of the platinum, all the PGMs. And the copper is quite significant. Right now, Congo is really, I think this last year, Congo was basically neck and neck, at least with Chile, in terms of annual production. So when you look at all those things and you say, what are you doing? It's difficult. Hence the reason why you see now, I think beginning this October, the Congo started putting quotas on their cobalt. The whole idea of doing that is to force beneficiation further beyond the cobalt sulfate, because you need to produce cobalt sulfate so that at least you are not, tied to these quotas. So they're saying, look at this, if you are not willing to do that, to go beyond that, then we're keeping you to this. And I know it might be seen like, no, this is short-termism, but at times that's what happens when you are caught in this situation. So for me, I think those are just points that I just want you to maybe at least to think about, to ponder over, whilst we talk about this energy transition battle.
Yeah, I mean, this is the right word, I think, battle. First, I really appreciate when I saw your work the other day, the way you analyze the supply chains and complexity and use the ECI somehow how a marker of if we are going the right direction or not. My reaction is a very short one, is that not every country will have either the same ladder or the same climbing wall. So each country that wants to add value is not the same pathway. Each one has to see what are my comparative advantages, what is the situation of my infrastructure, my power sector. And the word is each one has to find where is the sweet spot for that particular country or region to be. And second, integrated planning. There is no way, it's not going to happen from one day for the other to the other. It's not. So if, like you were saying about South Africa, I was there during the shortage for a while. It was crazy, like 6 hours a day without electricity. And so you have to have the power sector together with the industrial policy and the mining to structurally thinking how we can integrate actions and financing and attract investments. One thing that I saw firsthand, I was sitting in a restaurant together with some guys in Berlin, and someone from Namibia and someone from the South African government. They were just chatting, and the idea was, wow, guess what? Namibia is really solar rich. It belongs definitely to the Sun Belt like hell. And South Africa is really rich in iron ore, and the steelmaking in South Africa is really suffering from lack of energy or very expensive energy. So the chat there was Namibia and South Africa somehow partner to produce the intermediate product, the green intermediate product, and either ship that to Europe, the intermediate product, or to use the intermediate product in their own steel making. So it's not a short answer. And it's not the same pathway for everybody. And the message here is we have to dominate and use this momentum that critical minerals are getting more and more important to shift from the colonialist way of doing things, to tell the least, and get some value added to our societies. Not because of value, but because I think it's our right to have it this way. I am with Pedro. We have to rethink development.
Thank you. Yeah, and thanks for emphasizing those points on the importance of context and also the opportunity for regional integration. Yeah. So I know we're all a bit delayed here with everything, but I do want to just close out with two more quick questions, and one, bringing this actually back to the tax discussion. And I know, Taman, your team you've been working on this a bit. So I'd like you kind of to discuss actually some of the potential consequences that these downstreaming policies that we've been talking about might have for tax revenues and for the tax base. So, are there key trade-offs that you see here? And are there ways to sort of mitigate and manage them effectively?
Thanks. Okay. And first, I don't think there should be a trade-off between maximizing revenue from your extraction activities and having a successful downstream strategies. So to that point, it wasn't necessarily one or the other. You can do both, and you probably should do both. Going back to the first panel, I think the panelists were very clear that it's important to rely on domestic revenue to finance economic transformation. Like private finance and international finance only takes you so far. And so how the issue here is maybe like in a smaller scale, what was discussed in the larger scale in the first panel. the big risk here with value addition is that a lot of countries are issuing tax incentives to mining companies, hoping for to achieve value addition. And that's where the big risk is. And first of all, think about the first panel's kind of call for a new economy and domestic resources going to economic transformation. How are you going to finance that transformation if you're giving away your most reliable tax base coming from upstream mining companies? When you sign tax incentives, you're giving away future revenues that would naturally accrue to the state from those activities. So that's probably a bad start. And also, as Rosana said, that you don't think it's right to ask the mining companies themselves to have a full strategy for value addition. It belongs to the state to have its own industrial policy and to come up with a full list of a suite of associated enablers to the transformation. And so the way probably to think about incentives first is probably not target the upstream mining sector for tax incentives. They're doing fine if the quality of the mineral is right and if you've created the right conditions for investment in mining. Probably more to tailor them to the downstream activities itself. When there are cases where your strategy requires a bit of help from the state via subsidies or via incentives to make a project that might be at the not quite profitable, then maybe that's where the main case is. And it should probably be, unfortunately, a lot of decision makers in developing countries think of tax incentives, they give them a bit automatically. It's partly a legacy of the Western consensus and how countries were encouraged to really give away a lot of their tax base to attract investors, wrongly. But partly also because it's much easier to just sign off a tax incentive than to build a new power generation, to rebuild your whole power generation system in South Africa and really provide what miners and smelters need. But it's not because it's easier that it's more effective. You do need those primary enablers. You need infrastructure, you need electricity, you need a strong, stable legal system and regulatory environment. You have to think about the absorptive capacity of your market, domestically or regionally. And you also need to think about the financing for those downstream projects. And once you've considered all of this, then maybe the cherry on the cake or the one last step that will make value addition projects viable is a well-tailored tax incentive that you can revise at regular intervals to make sure it's achieving its goals.
Yeah, thanks a lot for those points. And I think it also touches on sort of like, in this context, what is your objective with the tax incentive? And I understand, or I think that really fundamentally, we're not seeking to incentivize mining. And as you mentioned, the role of the tax incentive is quite marginal in that decision. We're really trying to incentivize the downstreaming and the value creation. So being really critical on that balance is important. So I'll just take one more question, and then I'll take a couple questions from the audience. But I just wanted to give Gilberto the chance to sort of react, respond, or re-emphasize anything that the other panelists just touched on. Yeah.
No, absolutely. I totally agree with Clarkson. Adding value to your mining activity, it is important, right? Because you are making it more efficient, you are differentiating your activity, and you then can access to more revenue. And that in itself, it is fundamental. Also, I agree with Rosanna that this is very context specific. It has to do a lot with regional integration, absolutely. And just also that national aspirations that are expressed on industrial policy and other agreements on the economic and political stakeholders of that country. That's something that is fundamental to take into consideration, because without this, any kind of project lacks that viability that it needs. But in line with Thomas, I will say that what we need to be is careful in terms of if that value added, if that activity to make an activity more efficient and so on is not self-serving for that, in this case, the extractive company, right? In my previous life, I worked at an oil company. I worked on developing the first sustainable agenda a strategy for the company and dealing with that relation with the states, municipalities, and the oil communities. And the company didn't give small money to social programs or to promote economic development in those regions. Actually, in terms of in comparison to other like benchmarks, what the money allocated there, it was standard, right? The problem was that the projects that were supposed to be trying to promote the development of those communities were very self-serving. They were producing, for example, infrastructure that was mostly linked to the oil production. And they were creating even these expectations in the communities that everyone will be, or most people will be, oil engineers, when that actually didn't happen. And what happens then is that you create a way of living where you are paying for polluting and destroying those communities. And when the oil production ends, because nothing else was created, those communities also are destroyed because the environment is destroyed, the social fabric is destroyed. So that kind of like behavior that was supposed to be to improve or the value chain of this production was very self-serving. So that's my note of caution, right? Like it is not against the capability of countries or communities to add value in those, value chains that are related to critical minerals. Is the idea that sometimes you have to look at other possibilities, alternatives that actually maybe are expressing more the expectations of those communities or those countries because they relate to other things that they do and they do well and then they can do better. That are not necessarily linked to those critical minerals, but other options for development in the long run.
Thank you. Thank you all for just such a fantastic discussion. Before we close out, I did want to give the audience a chance to ask a couple. Yeah, you want to pass it around, Paul? I guess we'll take like the last panel. We'll take all of them first.
Hi, thank you so much. Good morning. My name is Peli Sankomo. I'm from South Africa. I'm a development economist. So this is really, really great conversation. I really like the 8 different entry points, but I want to raise 2 or 3 things. I think the first one is I may not want to hear more around the illicit tax because this is one of the sectors that has illicit tax financial flows in the continent. And governments are not really able to track the movement of money between the mining companies and as well as sometimes their mother holding companies in a different state. So I think that's a first issue around capacity. I think the second one, I really like the point that Klassen is raising around the regional integration because I think it's the way to go because then it allows countries to really rely on each other's capabilities. But the point I want to land into Gilberto around the supply chains. I think there's a direct link between the human capital strategy of the countries and the supply chains, because in essence, it delivers the type of industrial complexities that each country have, both at micro level, small level, and even at medium level. I would really like to hear you reflecting on what are the possibilities there, because the supply chains don't just land from heaven. They need to be built from bottom. And we should really be taking responsibility for that type of coordination of 3 different sectors to make it sure that there's a maximum value that get extracted from critical minerals. Thank you.
Hi, really fascinating conversation. My name is Bea Spiller. I'm a fellow at Resources for the Future's environmental economics think tank. I wanted to sort of see what you think about the issue of, being able to build up downstream capabilities, particularly like refining and battery, component manufacturing, for example, requires not just the energy and funds that you guys have mentioned, but also the technical know-how, and that seems to be missing in a lot of the world, right? So how do you view some of these policies to be able to bring in, the right technical skills, and is there any sort of tax policy that we could think about that could boost that technical know-how to be able to actually create that value in the country?
Let me just have one more.
Hi there. My name is John Jacoby. I'm the CEO of Goodweave International. We work to end child and forced labor and value chains. And I really appreciate this. This is a really rich discussion. So I know, despite the disclaimer up front that there wouldn't be much on indigenous communities, I think your last comment, Gilberto, speaks to the social license to operate mines in so many rural contexts. And what didn't come up, but you can imagine is on my mind, is child and forced labor. For example, perhaps our primary global example is in cobalt mining in the Congo. Well documented in Cobalt Red and other books and articles. And I think then what we're at an energy transition it's meant for the kids in the first place, that we can see ourselves to a sustainable future, but it can't be on their backs is kind of what we take from that. One other aspect of this linkage with child and forced labor and the climate challenge we face is that climate is also a driver of this kind of vulnerability. We've just released a report today. In fact, it's called From Risk to Resilience, and it's about how climate impacts can lead to greater vulnerability of children and workers in Nepal. It so happens in various other sectors. So my question is there room for future dialogue? We'd welcome it with JFI and others for precisely these questions about impacts on the rights and livelihoods of communities, to Gilberto's last point, to the development model that Rosanna spoke to, and then also a way to include in what seems like the converse of this good jobs question, which is this sort of exploitative labor concerns that are coming up in transition minerals mines in money contexts. Thanks.
Thanks a lot for all of the comments. I think I'm going to group a couple themes just in the interest of time. So one is on illicit financial flows, and then a couple questions came up around human capital or technical know-how, which I think a couple of us could address. And then, of course, I'm sorry, forgot your name, but we'll save your question and for last. But maybe, Thomas, you want to start with illicit financial flow since you spend most of your day thinking about it. So,
yes, illicit financial flows is a useful category to attract attention and particular attention to the problem of tax evasion and money leaving countries. And it's played that role very well, I think, in the last 10 years. Especially now, it's really, I mean, I mentioned Zambia earlier that geared up towards addressing the loss of tax revenue from copper. That political capital was, in part, came from the Mbeki report. It was 2013, 2015, and that really correlated to that. And I think that was super helpful. But today, I think we have in terms of we have the tools to really fight tax avoidance for large-scale industrial mining companies. It's still a challenge. It requires resources and political will, but we have the resources. I think the remaining challenge in Africa is around precious metal mined by artisanal small-scale miners. So all the gold in the Sahel or some of the coltan and others in DRC, that's much harder to address because it's the livelihood of thousands of people who live there. It's in conflict zones, and so it's much. And the minerals are so they can be transported in small quantities, so they go across border. So that's a remaining challenge for sure, and something that needs to be addressed at the continental level.
Wonderful, thank you. Yeah, and of course we can always continue the discussion after. Hopefully we'll still have time for coffee. But I don't know, maybe a couple of you. I don't, Gilberto, if you want to start around. I know you're doing work around technology transfer and the role of human capital and diversification. So
yes, very quickly. Thank you. Yeah. Great questions. You're absolutely right. The conversation related with the value chains get lost very often, and the challenges that it requires to be developed. And part of the idea with this is that when you highlight certain products that normally are overlooked in the development strategies because they are not the main exports that a basket of the country has, when they are overlooked in this way, they lack the resources, but also highlighting them, you are bringing attention to them as a guide, right? Because you are then talking about a specific sector that is out of the discussion. And when you're using them as a guide, and you have the ability to deconstruct those products because it's not only one product, but the value chain that's works on that product. And there's a capacity to have that map, and then with that, And with good data, you can then see the opportunities and challenges that you face along the value chain, right? Lately, for example, we built a map of the value chains between Mexico and the US, following two objectives. The first one was to highlight the importance of regional integration to make both countries more competitive. And the other one was for policymakers to have a chance to look into the gaps in those value chains so they can have policies that either take advantage of some opportunities there, but also to take care of risks on those value chains that are increasing because of the disruption that is going on trade. So that work is very important and has to be taken care of that. And the idea of technical knowledge, you are absolutely right. Countries, communities will learn in different ways, right? Like you can learn and you should learn by training, by doing things, but also you'll learn from your neighbors. And that's where what Rosanna was saying is fundamental, because when you are having this regional integration, when you're working with countries, with your neighbors or other countries on regional value chains, you are also learning from them. Firms imitate, right? Workers, when they move from one place to another, they carry those skills. Value chains or suppliers upgrade. So all those things help you with knowledge. And then some policies are also important here. Maybe it's not enough to train people. It's not enough to learn from your neighbors. Maybe you need to import knowledge. And that's when, we should push for more mobility of labor and skilled labor, kind of labor among our countries, because when you are doing that, you're also importing the capacity for those workers to bring knowledge to your country, to train, educate, and then you grow from there as well. So in that, those policies that are part of the tools the governments have for industrial policy, I think are very important to discuss further.
I'm really, truly sorry to cut us off because I do wish we could spend the rest of the day talking about this. But I'm being told that we are very, very over time. So I'm going to encourage us to, continue the discussion over here. We have the space until 1. And I'll definitely be coming up to some of you to address some of these specifically. So thank you all for your time and to our fantastic panelists. And
one word to what
yes, absolutely.
I had a lot to say, but just one word. It's not only it's violence, and one thing that is really, really bad, at least in Brazil, is rape in the region. So this is really critical, and it's not only on mining. Every big development that you do have this rape. It's really bad. So social licensing and looking carefully into those things, kind of key. Is not only respecting ESG things as we have to go well beyond it.
Absolutely. Thank you, Hosanna. Yeah, absolutely. So let's thank our panelists. Yeah. And we do just have brief concluding remarks from Alex before we hold you from the coffee. Yeah.
Hi, everyone. Barely even concluding remarks, really just thank yous, if you have a second. Just thank yous for putting this all on today. I'm Alex Jacobs. I'm our COO. First and foremost, our operations lead who's up in the booth, Clea Kalia, who put this whole thing together really marvelously. To the rest of the JFI team that helped program all of it, Paul, Maria, Sina, Molly Dechter, our editorial director, Maria, who's here as well. Thank you all to the moderators and panelists for really an unusually nuanced and sophisticated conversation today. To the audience and those who joined on Zoom, it means a lot. I know this is an extraordinarily busy and over-programmed week, so you chose to spend your morning with us. That means very much to the whole team here. And then finally to the just the CUNY Grad Center for hosting us, in particular Joan Passanisi and Kamala Smith. And without further ado, we hope you'll stick around for a little bit of food and coffee. Thank you all so much.
Yeah. All right.